He was the smiling scarecrow with a banjo, a Hee Haw staple, and a beloved Opry legend. But what really happened to StringBean remains one of the darkest and most haunting mysteries in country music history. Known for his long frame, comical stage presence, and old-time banjo playing, David "StringBean" Akeman was more than just a performer. He was a living piece of Appalachian folklore. But behind the laughter and overalls was a man who lived simply, trusted few, and unknowingly drew the attention of two cold-blooded criminals. On a quiet November night in 1973, that trust would be shattered forever. The murder of StringBean and his wife Estelle wasn't just a tragedy, it was a turning point for Nashville. It forced country stars to reassess their safety and ended the innocence of a simpler era. In this series, we peel back the curtain on StringBean's life, legacy, and the chilling events that unfolded in his final hours. What was taken, what was found, and what was left behind still haunts country music to this day. David "StringBean" Akeman's rise to fame wasn't a product of flashy showbiz tactics. It was built on authenticity, raw talent, and a down-home spirit that felt like your favorite uncle telling stories by the fire. Born in Annville, Kentucky, in 1915, StringBean was raised in poverty during the Great Depression. The struggles of those early years never left him, and even after he found fame, he remained frugal to the core. As a young man, he learned the banjo from his father and quickly developed a unique old-time clawhammer style that set him apart from his contemporaries. In an era when country music was beginning to shift toward the polished Nashville sound, StringBean clung proudly to his roots. He started playing semi-professionally in the 1930s and landed gigs with prominent country acts like Asa Martin. But it wasn't until he teamed up with Bill Monroe, the father of bluegrass, that StringBean truly began carving out his legacy. As Monroe's banjo player, he added a rhythmic grit to the bluegrass boys that fans loved. Still, StringBean was never quite comfortable in the shadow of another man's name. He struck out on his own in the late 1940s, and by the 1950s he was not only recording solo records, but also gaining a reputation as a comedic performer. What made StringBean unforgettable wasn't just his music, it was his presence. Tall, lanky, and always dressed in a shirt tucked into pants that drooped to his knees, he created a look and persona that turned heads and warmed hearts. That image became iconic thanks to his recurring role on Hee Haw, where he delivered jokes with a sly grin and always had a banjo slung over his shoulder. Despite his goofy on-screen antics, offstage StringBean was humble, soft-spoken, and deeply loyal to his family and friends. He married Estelle Stanfill in 1945, and the two shared a quiet, simple life outside of Nashville. They lived in a modest cabin in Ridgetop, Tennessee, where they tended their garden, raised chickens, and avoided the glitz of celebrity life. They never had children, but their love for each other was deep and enduring. StringBean's peers admired him not just for his talent, but for his refusal to let success change him. He was the same man picking banjo at the Opry as he was sipping coffee on his front porch. But StringBean's fear of banks and his old-school approach to money would eventually put a target on his back. As his fame grew, rumors began circulating that he kept large amounts of cash hidden in his home. He distrusted financial institutions, a habit formed during the Great Depression, and preferred to be paid in cash. Friends warned him, and he even joked about it on Hee Haw, but the wrong people were listening. What started as a life of simplicity and joy was now marked by a creeping sense of danger, one that no one realized until it was far too late. By the early 1970s, StringBean and Estelle were beloved staples in the country music community, seen as symbols of an older, purer era. But even as his star rose higher thanks to regular appearances on Hee Haw, StringBean remained unchanged by fame. He still drove his old pickup truck, wore hand-me-down clothes, and lived in the same modest log cabin he'd shared with Estelle for decades. To outsiders, it was charming. To those who knew him, it was just who he was: genuine, content, and deeply suspicious of change. But what StringBean didn't know was that his humble lifestyle and his distrust of banks was becoming common knowledge far beyond the tight-knit Opry circle. Word began to spread in the back rooms of Nashville honky-tonks, and beyond that, the banjo-picking comic kept thousands of dollars in cash stashed away in his cabin. He had lived through the Great Depression and never forgot the fear of losing everything overnight. As a result, he didn't believe in banks, safes, or even writing checks. He paid for everything in cash. Rumors swirled that he kept tens of thousands hidden in jars, under floorboards, maybe even in the walls. It was this belief, this unproven but widely accepted myth, that set a dark plan in motion. On the night of November 10, 1973, StringBean and Estelle were returning home from a performance at the Grand Ole Opry. As they pulled into their driveway in Ridgetop, they had no idea that two young men, brothers John and Marvin Douglas Brown, were already inside, lying in wait. The Browns were small-time criminals who had grown up hearing about StringBean's fortune in cash. They weren't after fame or revenge, they wanted money, fast. The brothers had been watching StringBean for weeks and picked that night to strike. When StringBean opened the cabin door, the Browns ambushed him. A struggle broke out, and within seconds, a shotgun blast rang out through the quiet Tennessee woods. StringBean collapsed just inside his home, fatally shot. Estelle, who had been only a few steps behind, tried to flee. She ran toward the woods in terror, hoping to find help in the dark, but she, too, was gunned down. The Browns ransacked the cabin, frantically searching for the supposed stash of cash, but they found nothing. The life savings they'd risked everything for wasn't where they thought it would be, or perhaps it was never there at all. The crime stunned Nashville. It sent shockwaves through the Grand Ole Opry, the country music world, and fans across the nation. How could such a senseless, brutal act take the life of someone so universally loved? News stations reported on the tragedy with disbelief, and tributes poured in from some of the biggest names in country music. Roy Acuff wept on stage. Minnie Pearl spoke openly about her heartbreak. It wasn't just the murder. It was the violation of someone who had represented kindness, humor, and humility in an industry that often devoured its own. But in the midst of the shock, one question haunted everyone. If StringBean was killed for his hidden fortune, where was it? That mystery about whether the rumors of hidden money were ever true would linger for decades. Some say the Browns simply didn't know where to look. Others whisper that someone found it long before them. But one thing was certain: the life of David StringBean Akeman had ended in violence, and the true weight of what was lost that night was just beginning to settle in. In the days that followed the brutal murders of StringBean and Estelle Akeman, the city of Nashville was plunged into mourning. This wasn't just the loss of a beloved entertainer. This was the murder of a man who symbolized humility, simplicity, and the soul of old-time country music. Fans, friends, and fellow Opry stars gathered in disbelief. The Grand Ole Opry dimmed its lights. A special tribute aired, featuring still photos of StringBean in his overalls, banjo in hand, while "Keep on the Sunny Side" played softly in the background. Some wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence, still trying to make sense of how something so heinous could happen to someone so kind. The cabin in Ridgetop quickly became a makeshift memorial. Locals left flowers, candles, and handwritten notes along the gravel road. Others made pilgrimages to the site, not just to mourn, but to understand. How could a man so cherished, living such a quiet life, become the victim of such unimaginable violence? The simple log home, once a symbol of StringBean's humble values, now stood as a reminder of the vulnerability even fame couldn't protect against. Within a few days, police zeroed in on their suspects. The Brown brothers hadn't exactly been discreet. Their background was already steeped in petty crime, and word on the street was that they'd been bragging about their plans to rob the Banjo Man. The police arrested them swiftly. John Brown was caught hiding at his grandmother's house. Marvin was arrested shortly afterward. Both men were charged with double homicide. The trial that followed was one of the most emotional in Tennessee history. Country music royalty filled the courtroom, sitting shoulder to shoulder with devastated fans. Minnie Pearl testified, her voice cracking with grief. So did Roy Acuff and Grandpa Jones, who had been the one to discover the bodies. Jones recalled arriving at the cabin that morning, confused when StringBean didn't show up for their regular hunting trip. When he walked inside, he found his friend's body by the fireplace. Estelle's was later found outside, not far from the woodpile. The image haunted him for the rest of his life. Prosecutors painted a picture of cold, calculated murder. The Browns had come looking for cash and killed 2 innocent people in the process. The defense tried to argue it had been a robbery gone wrong, not a premeditated execution. But the jury wasn't buying it. John Brown was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Marvin Brown would receive the same. Justice, in the legal sense, had been served, but the wound left in Nashville was far from healed. In the years that followed, the story of StringBean's death became part of country music folklore. He wasn't just remembered for the way he died, but for how he lived. Opry performers made a point to honor him, keeping his memory alive with songs and stories. A scholarship was created in his name. His banjo was placed in the Country Music Hall of Fame, and every time the lights went down at the Opry, you could still feel a little bit of StringBean lingering backstage in spirit. But there was one lingering detail that no one could shake: the money. Despite the Browns' belief that a fortune was hidden inside that log cabin, no one ever found it. Not the police, not the Presley family, not even treasure hunters who later begged to investigate the property. Rumors swirled that a trusted friend or fellow musician had quietly removed the cash after the murder. Others believed StringBean had stashed it somewhere no one would think to look. Some even claimed it was buried under a tree behind the cabin. Whatever the truth, the mystery only added to the legend of StringBean Akeman. And as the years passed, one question remained. Was the real motive behind the murder as simple as greed, or was there something deeper going on, something darker, that the music world didn't want to admit? As the shock of StringBean and Estelle's murders rippled through Nashville and the country music world at large, another strange and almost mythical element began to overshadow the crime itself: the legend of StringBean's hidden money. Long before his death, there had been whispers backstage at the Opry and among his closest friends that StringBean didn't trust banks. He had come of age during the Great Depression and never fully shook the fear of losing everything overnight. So instead of putting his earnings in a savings account, he was said to have stored his money in cash, hidden somewhere on his property, possibly inside his home, or even buried in the yard. After his murder, this rumor exploded into a frenzy. Some claimed StringBean had as much as $20,000 to $30,000 stashed away. Others swore it was more. Police combed the cabin, tearing up floorboards, checking inside walls, lifting rugs, and crawling beneath the house. Still, nothing surfaced. Whatever the Brown brothers had hoped to find that night, they never did. Estelle's purse, untouched on the counter, seemed to mock their greed. Her life had been taken for nothing. But then, something strange happened. Not long after the case was closed, an Opry insider who wished to remain anonymous claimed that a small amount of cash, several $1,000s, had quietly been discovered after the investigation wrapped up. It wasn't found by police, they said, but by someone close to the family, someone trusted. The money was supposedly hidden inside an old pair of boots in a corner of the attic, so degraded from age and dust that it blended into the surroundings. No public statement was made, no press conference. The money, they claimed, was quietly removed out of respect for StringBean's privacy and the family's pain. Another version of the story began to circulate among die-hard country fans, that the money was actually buried in a coffee can under a specific oak tree behind the cabin. According to this tale, a close friend of StringBean's knew about the hiding spot, but vowed never to dig it up. It was never about the money. the friend allegedly said. It was about the man. The legend of the hidden stash grew over time, attracting amateur treasure hunters and curious fans to the site. Some claimed they saw people digging late at night on the property. Others said they'd found old Opry memorabilia buried deep in the woods, though no proof ever surfaced. One man claimed he'd located an old iron safe near the creek, rusted shut and too heavy to move. But by the time he returned with help, it was gone. Whether he fabricated the story or someone else found it first, no one could say. Still, the myth persisted. For years, local historians and country music enthusiasts speculated about the possible reasons for the secrecy. Maybe StringBean's distrust of banks was more than just Depression-era fear. Maybe he knew something. Maybe he had good reason to keep his fortune out of sight. After all, being a public figure in a world full of agents, producers, and opportunists meant you never really knew who you could trust. Adding another layer to the mystery was the fact that StringBean didn't live lavishly. Despite his long-running success on Hee Haw and the Grand Ole Opry, he drove an old truck, wore the same costume night after night, and lived in a modest log home. He didn't flaunt wealth, he never craved fame. If anything, he was a walking contradiction, a star who never wanted the spotlight, a millionaire who lived like a farmer. And that made the story of the hidden money even more tragic. Because if the rumors were true, if he really did keep thousands of dollars hidden away only to be murdered by men who left with nothing, then his death wasn't just senseless, it was futile. It was a man's deepest fear come to life, a nightmare he had tried to outsmart by living simply, quietly, and off the radar. But secrets don't stay buried forever, and in the decades that followed, people would begin to wonder, was there something even more valuable hidden in that cabin? Something besides money, perhaps a truth the industry didn't want uncovered? The arrests of Marvin and John Brown brought a cold, but needed sense of closure to the horrific case. The two men, cousins from a troubled background, had committed one of the most senseless and brutal crimes in the history of country music. But even after their capture, the details surrounding the case remained murky, some even downright bizarre. At first, both men denied involvement. Marvin Brown, who had a long rap sheet, acted cool and collected, while John, visibly more shaken, barely spoke. But under pressure, John eventually cracked. He confessed, not just to the robbery, but to the murder. In his account, Marvin had been the one to pull the trigger, but John admitted to being inside the house and participating in the break-in. He said they expected to find thousands of dollars, possibly tens of thousands, stashed in the home. But when all they found were a few dollars and a helpless elderly couple, things spiraled. According to the confession, after shooting StringBean just outside the house, they turned their attention to Estelle, who had tried to escape. She fled up the hallway, screaming for help, but Marvin shot her in the back. That detail chilled the court. Estelle had made it close to the phone, close to calling for help. She might have survived. The trial, held in 1974, was a media storm. Every major outlet covered it. Country fans packed the courtroom. StringBean's friends from the Grand Ole Opry sat in the front row, their faces dark with grief and disbelief. Bill Monroe, Grandpa Jones, Roy Acuff, they all came. And when the details of the killings were read aloud, how the Browns waited inside the house for hours, how they ambushed the couple without hesitation, people wept openly. The defense tried to paint a picture of desperation, poverty, misguided youth. They said the Browns didn't intend to kill, only to rob. But the jury didn't buy it. The brutality was too much. The outcome, too final. Both men were found guilty. Marvin received 2 life sentences for first-degree murder. John, though his cooperation was noted, also received a life sentence. There was no parole, no second chance. And yet, the story didn't end there. In 2014, 4 decades after the murder, John Brown was quietly granted parole. The decision caused outrage. Music fans, including country legends who were still alive, voiced their disgust. How can you murder 2 innocent people in cold blood and get to walk free? One former Opry member asked. The public sentiment was fierce, especially in Nashville, where the memory of StringBean had become almost sacred. John Brown walked out of prison at age 64, supposedly a reformed man. He never gave another interview. Marvin, however, remained behind bars until his death in 2003. But the trial raised more than just legal questions. It opened the door to a darker conversation, one that still haunts the country music community. Why had two men, who knew StringBean only by reputation, targeted him with such precision? Had they heard rumors of his hidden wealth? Were they tipped off by someone in the music world? Or did they act on a hunch, fueled by nothing but greed and the allure of fame? Some believe the Browns weren't acting alone, that they were tools used by someone else who wanted something from inside that cabin. But if that's true, no proof ever surfaced. Still, the trial, though seemingly straightforward, left behind a cloud of uncertainty. It wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was about what StringBean's death represented: the fragility of fame, the danger of privacy, and the quiet evil that can lurk even in the most peaceful places. And so, justice was served, but the shadows lingered, because, in the eyes of many, the real story behind that night had only just begun. As years passed, and the dust from the trial settled, the mystery surrounding what the killers were really after grew deeper. For a long time, people assumed Marvin and John Brown simply believed StringBean had money hidden in his home. After all, it was common knowledge in Nashville that the old banjo player didn't trust banks. In an era where musicians were often exploited and paid in cash, rumors spread like wildfire that StringBean had thousands of dollars stashed in his modest log cabin. But those rumors weren't just idle talk. It wasn't until years after the murders, long after the Browns had been locked away, that a new discovery changed the way people looked at the crime. In 1993, 20 years after his death, builders renovating parts of the cabin made a jaw-dropping find behind a false wall and beneath a floorboard in the living room. Several $1,000s in cash, still neatly bundled and preserved. Not counterfeit, not stolen. StringBean's money, his private savings. Some bills dated back to the 1950s. The total sum? Over $20,000. It wasn't life-changing by today's standards, but for a country singer in the 1970s who had grown up during the Great Depression, it was a small fortune. And it confirmed what many had long suspected. StringBean didn't trust the system. He'd been paid cash his entire career and hid it around the house in clever places, likely not even telling Estelle where everything was kept. That discovery reignited old questions. How much did the Brown cousins know? Did someone tip them off about the money hidden in the cabin? Or had they simply heard the same rumors as everyone else? Could someone in the music business, someone closer to StringBean, have whispered something in the wrong ear? The idea that StringBean had secrets wasn't new. Friends said he was intensely private, even with his closest Opry companions. He'd make jokes on stage, but kept a close eye on who entered his home. Some even speculated that he had a network of hiding places beyond just the cabin. A buried safe on the property, a hollowed-out post on the front porch, even a small vault in the barn. These whispers only added to the mythos. The image of a humble, funny banjo player living modestly while hoarding cash like an old mountain outlaw fascinated people. But others, especially his surviving family and friends, found it heartbreaking, because if StringBean had told someone, anyone, where the money was, perhaps he and Estelle might have been able to move somewhere safer. Maybe the Browns wouldn't have come at all. In interviews years later, Opry members recalled subtle hints, how StringBean avoided modern conveniences, how he always insisted on being paid in cash, how he kept a locked drawer in his dressing room and never used a bank teller. One friend remembered him saying, "The bank don't know my name, and I plan to keep it that way." It was a joke at the time, but now, in hindsight, it feels like a warning. The discovery of the hidden cash in 1993 didn't just deepen the mystery, it humanized the legend. It showed a man scarred by poverty and protective of what little he had earned. A man who had clawed his way out of the coal camps and wasn't about to lose it all to bankers, crooks, or anyone else. But the question still lingered like a ghost in the Tennessee hills. If that much money was still hidden 20 years after his death, how much more was never found? And did someone know it was there all along? StringBean had taken his secrets to the grave, but even from beyond it, he kept the world guessing. After the discovery of StringBean's hidden money in the floorboards, the mystique surrounding his murder only intensified. But what came next wasn't just a conversation about cash or cold case theories. It was about legacy, about how a man like David StringBean Akeman, who made the world laugh with his banjo and suspenders, had quietly become one of country music's most tragic folk legends. In the years that followed, fans and locals alike began to treat his old cabin like a kind of shrine. People would visit the area, walking quietly along the gravel road near the property, leaving behind little tokens, banjo picks, handwritten notes, flowers. Some claimed to feel a heaviness in the air as they passed by. Others spoke of an eerie stillness that blanketed the site. A few even whispered about ghost sightings, figures in overalls seen through fog, or the faint sound of banjo strings plucked in the wind. Whether you believe in hauntings or not, there's no denying the emotional residue that clings to places where something terrible has happened. And for many, StringBean's cabin became a symbol of injustice, a place where fame, simplicity, and vulnerability collided in the worst way. Rumors also began to swirl about a so-called curse surrounding the property. A string of minor incidents, contractors falling ill, mysterious equipment failures, even a small fire during one restoration attempt, fueled the idea that the land itself resisted change. Some believed StringBean's spirit was still there, guarding his treasures. Others felt it was Estelle, eternally waiting for the night her husband would come home. And then there was the matter of justice. While Marvin Brown died in prison in 2003, his cousin John Brown remained incarcerated for decades, until 2014, when he was quietly granted parole. The decision sparked outrage across Tennessee's country music circles and reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Opry veterans like Gene Shepard and Ricky Skaggs spoke out, saying StringBean and Estelle had been forgotten by a system too quick to forgive. Fans flooded online forums with tributes, anger, and disbelief. They took 2 innocent lives, one fan wrote, and now one of them walks free, while String lays in the ground. Still, not everyone was surprised. In truth, StringBean's murder had faded from public memory over the years, overshadowed by newer tragedies and fresher stars. But to the ones who remembered him, the ones who'd seen him live, laughed at his jokes, or heard his fingers dance on banjo strings, his loss still echoed like an unfinished song. In 2015, the Country Music Hall of Fame hosted a special exhibit on forgotten legends, and StringBean's name finally got its spotlight. A battered pair of overalls, a signed banjo, and a grainy photo of him and Estelle smiling outside the cabin stood on quiet display. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't grand, but it was honest, just like him. Even so, questions lingered. Why had the property remained sealed for so long? Why was the attic never searched thoroughly in the investigation? What else might have been hidden? And by whom? Those who knew StringBean best claimed he was more than the role he played on stage. Beneath the comedy was a deeply sensitive soul, a man who understood pain, poverty, and perseverance. A man who wore laughter like armor, and whose music carried the weight of mountains. Today, there's a small push among fans and historians to preserve his cabin as a landmark, to protect it not just as a crime scene or a curiosity, but as a reminder of how fame doesn't always come with safety, how sometimes, even when you try to live quietly and humbly, the world can still find you and take everything away. But perhaps StringBean's real revenge is in how he's remembered, not as a victim, but as a man who stayed true to himself, who played his last note with dignity, and who, even in death, refused to be forgotten. By the time the 50th anniversary of StringBean's death approached, the mystery hadn't so much been solved as it had been buried under layers of silence, speculation, and sorrow. In 2023, a quiet memorial was held by a small group of Opry veterans, local historians, and fans who still remembered the man whose life was stolen in one of country music's darkest chapters. But even that memorial didn't answer the question that still haunts the hills of Ridgetop, Tennessee. What really happened to StringBean? Sure, we know the facts. 2 men broke in looking for money, murdered String and Estelle, got caught, and served time. But the deeper question has always been why it happened the way it did. Why were the Browns so sure StringBean kept money hidden in the house? Why did they wait in the shadows so long? Why were certain parts of the investigation, like the attic, sealed off so quickly? And why did authorities leave behind so many unanswered questions? In the years since, there's been quiet talk among insiders. Some believe a third person might have been involved, someone who tipped the Browns off. Others whisper about connections to a larger theft ring in the Nashville area during the 70s, targeting celebrities known for keeping cash at home. In an old, unpublished interview from 1982, an ex-sheriff deputy even claimed that certain items found in the house went missing before they were officially cataloged. Items that might have proved someone else had been there before or after the murders. Even more haunting are the reports that Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, once asked a private detective to look into StringBean's murder. Why would Elvis's family be involved at all? It turns out StringBean and Elvis had shared a few private banjo sessions backstage at the Opry in the early 60s. According to a handwritten letter recently uncovered by a collector, Elvis reportedly told StringBean, "You're the only one here more country than me." The loss of StringBean, it seemed, was felt far beyond what anyone knew at the time. And then there's the cabin itself. In 2024, a new owner purchased the overgrown plot where StringBean's home once stood, announcing plans to turn it into a private museum honoring lesser-known country artists. But during the initial walkthrough, something strange was found in the ground beneath the fireplace, an old, rusted metal box. Inside were dozens of receipts, hand-drawn maps, and a worn leather journal with the initials DA. It hasn't been made public yet, but early leaks suggest the journal contains thoughts about fame, fear, and the growing paranoia StringBean was feeling in the months before he died. One line, in faded pencil, stood out. "I hear things at night. I think someone's watching us. Estelle says I'm just tired, but I know what I know." That single sentence adds a chilling layer to the already haunting story. What if StringBean knew something was coming? What if he sensed that his modest life, his garden, his music, his laughter was under threat? And what if the system around him, the very industry that made him famous, didn't do enough to protect him? At 58 years old, David StringBean Akeman had finally bought the kind of peace he'd worked for his entire life. A little house, a patch of land, a loving wife, and a banjo. That should have been enough. But the world came knocking, guns drawn, and took it all away. Today, as country music evolves and the old legends fade, StringBean's story remains one of the most tragic and most telling. It's a cautionary tale not just about crime, but about legacy, security, and what we choose to remember. What really happened to StringBean? Maybe we'll never know all the names, all the motives, all the secrets buried in the Tennessee dirt. But one thing is certain: the man may be gone, but the echo of his banjo still rings in the hollers, reminding us that even the gentlest souls can leave behind the loudest stories.